I'm not a thrill seeker. I don't jump out of planes, I don't ride motorcycles, and I sure as hell don't go out looking for trouble. Hiking is the one thing I do that's even remotely close to adventurous, and even then, I've always kept it simple: well-marked trails, plenty of supplies, tell someone where I'm going, and get out before dark. That's how I've always done it. No reason to change what works. But a few months ago, I broke my own rule. It was late October, and the air had that dry, crisp feeling like the whole forest was holding its breath before winter. I had a 3-day weekend, and I wanted to get in one last good hike before the weather really turned. I'd been reading about this place out near the Wyoming-Montana border. Lots of rolling ridges, old fire roads, and stretches of trail where you could walk for hours without seeing anyone. It wasn't too far of a drive, and from the topo maps, the elevation didn't look too brutal. I figured I'd do a long loop, about 18 miles, over the course of 2 days. Camp one night, finish the loop the next day, drive home before nightfall on Sunday. I left early on Saturday morning, reached the trailhead just after sunrise. My car was the only one there. That should have told me something. It was a well-established trailhead with a small gravel lot, a faded kiosk with a map and a bulletin board, and a rusty metal box with trail permits. I filled one out, stuffed it in the box, tightened the straps on my pack, and set off. The first few hours were easy. The trail followed a wide fire road that snaked along the side of a hill. Pines on either side, the scent of dried needles and cold earth in the air. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on your ears, broken only by the occasional bird call or the crunch of my boots. I passed a few side trails, mostly old ATV tracks or hunting paths, but I stayed on the main loop. Everything looked like it did on the map. I was making good time. By early afternoon, I reached a ridgeline where the trail split. Left would take me down to a small creek where I planned to camp. Right would continue the loop up toward the next ridge. I took the left, descending slowly through thickets of scrub oak and dry, gold-colored grass. I saw deer tracks in the dust, a few fresh. Around 4 o'clock, I reached the creek. It wasn't much, more of a trickle running through a narrow gully, but it was enough to filter some water and pitch camp nearby. I found a flat spot tucked beneath a copse of pines, maybe 50 yards from the water. No sign of anyone else. No wrappers, no fire rings, no boot prints. Just undisturbed dirt and moss and the distant sound of trickling water. I set up my tent, gathered a few dead branches for a small fire, and sat down to eat a simple dinner: jerky, trail mix, and a granola bar. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, it was full dark. That night was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones even with layers on. I woke up once around midnight to pee, and the moon was so bright it looked like someone had turned on a floodlight over the trees. Everything was silver, silent, and still. I crawled back into my bag and tried to sleep, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch shifting under frost. The next morning, I took my time breaking camp. Ate a protein bar, filtered more water, double-checked the map. I had about 10 miles to go to complete the loop. The plan was to hike up the next ridge, swing back toward the north, and descend through a long, narrow valley that would eventually bring me back to the trailhead from the other side. Easy. I didn't even make it 2 miles before I hit the first problem. The trail was supposed to veer northwest after a short climb, but I reached a split that wasn't marked on the map. Both paths looked equally used. One went straight up the ridge like I expected. The other sloped down into a narrow gully. I checked my compass and GPS. Signal was weak, bouncing, but the ridge seemed right. I chose the uphill trail and pressed on. It started to change fast. The trees got thicker, the trail narrower. It was like walking through a tunnel of green and brown, with branches grabbing at my arms and dead leaves crackling underfoot. I didn't see any blazes. No cairns, no signs of maintenance. I thought maybe it was just a rough patch. Some trails get choked up in the off-season, but something felt wrong. It didn't match the map. The ridge wasn't supposed to be this steep. I kept going another half-mile before I stopped. I was sweating, breathing hard, even though the air was cold. I dropped my pack, took a long drink from my bottle, and tried to make sense of the terrain. I climbed a small outcrop and scanned the horizon. What I saw didn't line up. The ridges were too close together. There should have been a wide valley between them, but everything looked compressed, tangled. And behind me, the trail I'd come up was already hard to see, just a narrow crease vanishing into brush. That's when I realized I'd gone off trail. Not just a little detour. I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I wasn't panicked yet. I've dealt with overgrown trails and bad maps before. I figured I'd backtrack, find the fork again, and try the other path. Maybe I'd lose an hour, but it wasn't the end of the world. Except I couldn't find the fork. I started back down, carefully retracing my steps. But the trail had vanished. Completely. The dirt was churned with fallen leaves and pine needles. Everything looked the same. I tried to follow the landmarks I remembered. A twisted pine, a fallen log, a rock shaped like a boot, but they all blended together. The terrain was steep and uneven, and my sense of direction started to fray. I stopped, turned in place, scanned the trees. Nothing looked familiar. I checked my GPS again, still bouncing, still useless. Compass said north was behind me, but that didn't help. I didn't know where I was anymore. I kept moving, hoping I'd cross a trail, a clearing, anything. But it all looked the same. Trees, rocks, cold air. I could feel the panic starting to build in my chest like pressure behind my ribs. I forced myself to sit down and breathe. I had food, water, a good pack. I wasn't hurt. The weather was cold, but not deadly. I wasn't gonna die out here, not yet. I pulled out the map again and tried to line up the ridges I could see with the ones on the paper. But the angles didn't match. It was like I'd wandered into a completely different area. Some old burn scar that hadn't been updated in years. I decided to follow the slope down. Water runs downhill, and if I found a creek or a drainage, I could follow it to a bigger stream, maybe even a road. It was a long shot, but better than going in circles. I spent the next 3 hours stumbling through brush, climbing over deadfall, scraping my arms on branches. I slipped twice, once hard enough to bang my hip and elbow on a rock. I yelled a few times, just to hear something, anything, but my voice vanished into the trees. Late in the afternoon, I found a small stream, barely more than a trickle, but it was water. I followed it down. The banks were steep and rocky, with slick moss and sharp roots. I moved slowly, careful not to fall again. As the sun started to drop, I saw something ahead, a shape through the trees. I pushed toward it, heart pounding. For a second, I thought it was a cabin or an old shack, but it wasn't. It was a truck, an old, rusted-out pickup, half buried in leaves and vines. The tires were flat, windshield cracked, body streaked with rust. It had clearly been there for years. No plates, no windows, just abandoned, forgotten. There were drag marks in the dirt behind it. Something had tried to move it, or maybe it slid during a storm. I looked around. No path, no road, no tire tracks. It was just here, like it had been dropped from the sky. I don't know why, but the sight of it filled me with this awful, buzzing fear, like static in my teeth. It meant people had been here once, but not anymore. I kept going, sticking close to the stream. My legs were shaking. My hands were numb. I found a flat patch of dirt near a bend in the creek and set up my tent again, barely able to get the stakes in the hard ground. I didn't eat. I just crawled inside, zipped the flap, and sat there in the dark, listening. That night, something moved outside. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. Heavy steps, slow and careful. Branches cracking. Then nothing. I gripped the knife in my pack so tight my fingers cramped. Morning came gray and bitter cold. I broke camp fast and kept moving. The stream grew wider, deeper. Around noon, I saw a fence, barbed wire, half collapsed. Beyond it, an old road. Cracked pavement, weeds growing through. I followed it for miles. I was starving, exhausted, feet blistered raw. Late that afternoon, I saw a sign, faded green, with bullet holes. It said Forest Service Road 12B. Below it, someone had spray-painted "No trespassing" in red letters. I didn't care. 2 hours later, I reached a paved road. Half an hour after that, I flagged down a pickup hauling firewood. The guy didn't ask questions. just handed me a water bottle and drove me 30 miles to the nearest. The morning had been perfect. Cool air, the kind that nips at your skin just enough to wake you up. The forest smelled like damp earth and pine, the ground soft under my boots. I'd hiked this trail before years ago, but memory is a funny thing. It smooths over the rough edges, makes everything seem simpler than it is. The first sign was small, fallen tree, one I didn't remember. It blocked part of the path, forcing me to climb over. The bark was slick with morning dew, and my fingers dug into the soft, rotting wood as I hauled myself up. No big deal. Trees fall all the time. But then the markers disappeared. They were supposed to be there, little yellow squares nailed to the trunks every 100 yards or so. I slowed, scanning the trees. Nothing. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn? I checked my phone. No signal. The map in my pocket was useless. It showed the trail as a neat, unbroken line, but the land didn't match. The slope was steeper here, the underbrush thicker. I kept walking. The forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out the sun. The air felt heavier, damp and still. My boots sank into the mud with every step, the sound wet and loud in the silence. No birds, no wind, just the creak of branches and the occasional rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. I told myself it was an animal. Then I saw the shoe. It was lying on its side, half buried in the mud. A hiking boot, old and weathered, the laces frayed. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. Someone had lost it, or left it. I kept walking. The slope turned into a ravine, the ground dropping away sharply. I had to grab onto roots and rocks to keep from sliding. My palms were raw, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. At the bottom, the air was colder. The shadows stretched long, even though it couldn't have been past noon. That's when I saw the tent. It was a sad, sagging thing, the fabric torn and stained. One of the poles had snapped, leaving it slumped like a wounded animal. A backpack lay nearby, the straps chewed through, the contents spilled across the ground. A rusted water bottle, a moldy notebook, a knife with a broken blade. I didn't touch anything. The notebook was open. The pages were warped from rain, the ink smeared, but I could still make out the words. Asterisk day 4. Trail's gone. Can't find the markers. Think I'm going in circles. Asterisk. Asterisk day 6. Out of food. Saw something moving in the trees. Not an animal. Asterisk. Asterisk day 8. It's watching me. Asterisk. I dropped the notebook. The forest was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, makes you hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are. I ran. Branches whipped at my arms, my face. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. My lungs burned. My legs ached. I didn't stop. Then light. A break in the trees. Clearing. And beyond it, the trail. The real one with yellow markers and packed earth. I stumbled onto it, gasping, my hands shaking. I didn't look back. The hike out was a blur. My body moved on its own, one foot in front of the other, until I saw the parking lot. My car was still there, alone in the fading light. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I never went back. Sometimes, though, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that notebook, and I wonder who or what was watching. I've never been one for crowds. Cities always made me feel boxed in. Too many people, too many sounds, too many things going on at once. That's part of why I started hiking. At first it was day trails, just a way to break away from the noise of my apartment, from the people at work, from myself, if I'm being honest. Over time, it became more than that. Hiking turned into a kind of quiet obsession. The solitude, the rhythm of footfall after footfall, the weight of the pack on my back. It all grounded me in a way nothing else ever did. Last October, I took a week off work to drive up to the northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I'd read about a set of old, lesser-known logging trails that were repurposed into hiking routes in the 90s but never got much attention. People preferred the bigger names, pictured rocks, Porcupine Mountains, that sort of thing. But I wanted something off the grid, somewhere I wouldn't see another soul for days. I got what I asked for. The route I chose had been posted on an old blog by a guy who used to hike forgotten trails. The post was nearly 10 years old. He'd mapped out a 30-mile loop that cut deep through forest and past old logging clearings, with minimal elevation change but enough distance to push your legs. He mentioned a few landmarks: an abandoned shack used by loggers, a collapsed bridge over a dried-up stream, a cluster of boulders that locals supposedly called the Bones. I printed out his map, copied down the GPS coordinates just in case, and packed like I always do: extra socks, dried food, 2 knives, a small hatchet, backup batteries, water purifier, first aid kit, and a GPS beacon I never expected to need. I parked at the edge of a service road just after sunrise. It was colder than I expected for early October, frost still clinging to the edges of fallen leaves. My boots crunched against the dirt as I stepped into the woods, already thick with yellow and orange. I felt that familiar sense of calm start to settle in. I was alone out there, completely, totally alone. The first 2 days went by without anything unusual. The trail was overgrown in some parts, sure, but still navigable. My compass and the old GPS coordinates lined up well enough, and I recognized the landmarks from the blog post. The abandoned shack was just as the guy described: a sagging structure with moss-covered planks and the remains of a wood stove inside. I camped nearby that night, setting up my tent on a patch of soft ground beneath a fir tree, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the pines. On day 3, things started to shift. The trail veered northwest, cutting deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, light filtering through only in narrow bands. The undergrowth got thicker too, ferns, brambles, and ground pines snagging at my boots and pack. I followed the route carefully, matching the printed map with my GPS, but the trail seemed to fade with each mile. The blog post warned about this, said that this part hadn't been maintained in years, that the markers were basically gone. He'd used landmarks instead, like the V tree, a tall oak that split cleanly at the trunk, shaped like a Y, just past a small clearing. I found it late in the day, just like the picture in the post. Weathered bark, one side stripped by lightning, the other side thick with greenish moss. That was supposed to mean I was on track, but something about that clearing put me on edge. I couldn't explain it, just a feeling that it wasn't as untouched as it looked. The ground there was packed tighter than it should have been for somewhere that remote. There were no prints, nothing obvious, but it felt like someone had been through, maybe recently. I pushed the thought out of my mind and hiked another hour before setting up camp. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking I was hearing something just beyond the tent walls. Not animals. Those sounds I know well. Deer moving through brush, small limbs cracking under weight, the distant yip of a fox. This was different. It was like a soft, repeated thump, maybe 30 feet away, like something heavy being dropped in the dirt. I sat up and listened, holding my breath. Then silence. Total silence. No wind. No insects. Nothing. I stayed awake, knife in hand, until the first light touched the edge of the tent. When I finally stepped outside, there was nothing out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. Just the normal morning quiet of forest life waking up. I told myself it was probably a branch falling, maybe a tree finally giving way somewhere out of sight. But I packed up faster than usual that day. I didn't eat breakfast. I just filled my water bottle from a nearby stream, shouldered my pack, and kept moving. The trail was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than a path. I relied on my compass and GPS, checking both every half mile, double-checking against the blog's notes. I started to notice other strange things, too. Small details, subtle. Trees with bark stripped too high to be natural. A pile of stones stacked deliberately along a ridge. Not cairns, not trail markers. Just rocks, maybe 20 of them, stacked in a rough column with dead moss between them. By early afternoon, I'd reached the dried-up streambed with the collapsed bridge. The beams were splintered and sagging, just like the blog described, but the streambed itself didn't look as dry as I expected. The mud was still soft, recent. It hadn't rained in over a week, so that didn't make much sense. I crossed anyway, testing each step on the wooden planks until I reached the far side. That's when I found the first real sign something was off. Just past the bridge, where the forest narrowed into a corridor of tall spruce, I found a shirt snagged on a low branch. It was torn, covered in mud, but recent, fabric still strong, color not completely faded. A small flannel, adult-sized. No blood, no signs of distress, just left there. Maybe dropped by another hiker. Maybe, but that was the thing, this trail was barely known. It wasn't in any guidebook. It wasn't maintained. It hadn't been mentioned online in nearly a decade. Who the hell would be out here besides me? The air felt different after that. Heavier. Every sound felt louder. My footsteps, the creak of my pack, the rustle of wind in the trees. I kept walking, but slower, more deliberate. I checked behind me often. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I stopped earlier that night, around 4 p.m., and set up camp near a boulder outcropping that had been mentioned in the blog. Supposedly a good windbreak. I cooked a small dinner, just freeze-dried stew and some nuts, then turned in before the sun fully set. I kept the knife under my pillow. I woke up twice that night, once to the sound of something brushing against the outside of the tent. Not a paw or claw, something wider like a body brushing past fabric. The second time was worse. I woke to the sound of a click, a deliberate, metallic click, like the sound of a lighter or a lock snapping shut. Came from maybe 10 feet away. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes open, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Then silence again. Too long, too deep. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out at first light, my stomach dropped. There were boot prints around the campsite. Human prints. They circled the tent once. Wide boot treads, bigger than mine. They came in from the north, looped around the boulder, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I packed everything in under 5 minutes and started hiking faster than I ever had before. I checked the GPS every 10 minutes now, convinced I'd wandered into some kind of private land or territory. The loop was supposed to curve back east by midday, but the trees started looking unfamiliar. Landmarks stopped matching. I was off trail. I don't know how it happened. I'd followed everything carefully, but something had pulled me west. The GPS still worked, but it wasn't showing any trail nearby. Just empty forest. I turned east and walked for hours, trying to reconnect to the loop. Nothing. Then, around 3 p.m., I found the cabin. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't in the blog. But there it was, tucked between trees, set back from a narrow deer trail. One story, rough-hewn logs, tin roof rusted through in patches. No chimney, windows boarded. I stood there a long time, just staring. I should have kept walking, but I didn't. I approached carefully, stepping around the side. The door was closed, but not locked. A rope handle nailed boards. I knocked once, more out of habit than anything. No answer. I opened it. Inside was dark. The smell hit me first, mildew, damp wood, and something else, something faintly metallic. The inside was stripped bare. Just a table, a cot with no mattress, and a rusted metal drum in the corner. There were old tools on the wall, hooks, saws, rusted nails in a row. And on the table, a map. My map. The same route, same markings, same notes, except it wasn't my handwriting. There were dates scribbled on it. Several. The most recent was 3 days ago. I backed out slowly, heart racing, eyes scanning the tree line. I was 34 the year I decided to hike Deadfall Ridge alone. I had done solo hikes before, never anything too long, but enough to know what I was doing. I kept things clean and lightweight. Good boots, a decent ultralight pack, bear spray, GPS, backup map, and compass, all the basics. I didn't do this to prove anything. I just liked the quiet, the pace of my breath, the ache in my thighs and shoulders after a long day, the way everything smells different in the forest. Sharper, almost electric. My wife used to say the only time I looked calm was when I came back from a solo hike. Deadfall Ridge was remote and barely touched. I picked it after hours spent scrolling through Forest Service maps and poking around old hiking forums. No recent posts about it. No official trails. Just a mention here or there about it being tough. It wasn't even called Deadfall Ridge officially. It had a different name on the topo map, Wheeler Spur, I think, but Deadfall Ridge was what the locals called it. Apparently, the name came from the number of fallen trees all over the place. Windstorms and beetles had done a number on it years ago, and nobody ever cleared it out. That suited me fine. I wanted solitude. I started in the early morning from a fire road that led off a dusty gravel trail about 3 hours north of Missoula. There was a turnout with enough space for 2 or 3 cars, but mine was the only one there. I logged my trip plan on my GPS and took a picture of the car with the timestamp, just in case. My plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles, bushwhack up the ridge to a small lake I'd seen on the map, unnamed, and camp there overnight, maybe 2 nights if the weather held, then hike out the same way. It was only 3 days at most, but it felt like enough. The first few miles were slow. The terrain was worse than I expected. The name was no joke, deadfall everywhere. I had to scramble over logs, duck under half-fallen trees, sidestep loose debris. Everything felt sharp and jagged. No clear path, just the occasional game trail that disappeared into brush. But I didn't mind. I liked the focus it took. There wasn't room in my head for anything else. Every step was a decision. Every foot placement was calculated. By the time noon came around, I was drenched in sweat and had already refilled my water twice using the filter pump. I made it about 8 miles in by 4 that afternoon. My legs were shaking, and I had a headache creeping in behind my eyes. I found a flat spot in a shallow clearing, just off a wide gully. The gully must have been a seasonal runoff path. Dry now, but full of slick rocks and twisted roots. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and heated up a bag of rice and beans on the little alcohol stove. I ate slow, watching the sky turn from pale blue to orange to gray. No animals, no birds, just wind in the trees. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. I laid awake for a while that night, listening. Not for anything in particular, just listening. The forest felt too still. No rustling, no crackling of branches, no hoots or chirps. Just the occasional groan of trees shifting in the wind. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I felt something I hadn't in a long time, something like caution. Not the kind you get when you think there's a bear nearby. Something deeper. I pushed it down and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I broke camp early and climbed toward the ridge. It was steeper than it looked on the topo map, less of a gradual slope and more of a hands and knees scramble in places. I kept having to check the GPS to keep myself on a straight course. I lost count of how many times I slipped, how many branches whipped my face. At one point, I had to stop and duct tape a hot spot on my heel. I was bleeding from both shins by the time I reached the top. But the view, the lake sat like a glass mirror in a bowl of jagged stone. Pines crept up around it like a wall. No signs of people, no fire rings, no footprints. I stood there breathing hard, pack hanging from one shoulder, and I felt a grin crawl across my face. This was what I wanted. No noise, no deadlines, just me and the wind and the water. I camped by the lake that night, filtered some water, soaked my sore feet, ate another hot meal. I even let myself lay back on a flat rock and stare at the stars. They looked so much brighter up there. For the first time since the trip started, I felt calm, really calm. I must have fallen asleep in the tent sometime after 10. I woke up around 2 in the morning. Something had snapped outside the tent. Sharp, loud. I sat up fast, heart pounding, hand already on the zipper of the tent flap. But then, nothing. Just silence again. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Still nothing. I told myself it was just a branch falling. Maybe a deer stepping on something. But I didn't sleep again that night. I just laid there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the silence. In the morning, I broke camp fast. I didn't even boil water, just ate a protein bar and packed everything up. My plan had been to stay another night, but I wanted to be moving. I told myself it was just nerves, but I knew better. The descent from the ridge was worse than the climb. Everything was loose. I slipped 3 times in the first hour. One time I caught myself on a stump. Another time I fell flat and cracked my knee on a rock. By the time I made it back down into the forest, my left pant leg was soaked with blood, and I was walking with a limp. I kept going. I didn't want to stop. Something about that place had shifted. It wasn't just hard anymore. Felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. It started around mile 13. I had just passed a dry creek bed when I heard it. Movement. Fast. Heavy. Off to the right. I froze. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a deer. I didn't know how I knew that. I just did. It sounded bipedal. Crunching leaves. Snapping twigs. Then it stopped. I waited, every hair on my body standing up. I listened for 5 minutes. Nothing. Then I moved. Fast. I didn't run. I couldn't with the terrain, but I picked up the pace as much as I could. Every step felt loud. Every breath sounded like a shout. And then I heard it again. Behind me this time. Closer. I stopped and turned. Nothing there. Just trees. But I could feel it. I could feel eyes on me. My skin prickled. My gut clenched. And I took off again. Still walking, still careful, but faster. I didn't look back again. Not until I reached the gully where I had camped the first night. It was dusk by then. I knew I couldn't make it out before dark. My knee was throbbing. My legs were shaking. I set up camp as fast as I could and didn't even bother cooking. Just slid into the tent and zipped it up. That night was the worst of my life. I didn't sleep. Not even a little. There were footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the tent. I lay there with my knife in one hand and my bear spray in the other, barely breathing. Every time I thought it was over, they started again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Sometimes they stopped right by my head, like someone standing over me, listening. I never saw anything. I didn't dare unzip the tent. But it wasn't an animal. I would bet my life on that. It wasn't an animal. When dawn finally came, I didn't pack up properly. I just grabbed everything and shoved it into my pack. I was moving before the sun was fully up. My legs were stiff. My knee was worse. Every step felt like a nail driving into the bone. But I kept going. And then the trail disappeared. Not suddenly. Not like I turned a corner and it was gone. But gradually, like it had never been there in the first place. I was following my GPS, same as always, but the terrain didn't match. Trees where there shouldn't be trees. No clearing where there should be one. And then the GPS started glitching. The map froze. Then the battery dropped from 68% to nothing. I stood there, staring at the blank screen, sweat pouring down my face. Then I pulled out the compass and map. Sat down. Tried to figure out where I was. Couldn't. No matter how many times I checked the contours, nothing lined up. It was like I had walked off the edge of the world. I tried not to panic. Picked a direction and started walking. West, toward where the road should have been. I walked for hours. My limp got worse. My hands were shaking. I fell twice. The sun was high, but it was cold. Then I saw the trees change. Pine gave way to birch, and I realized I'd gone the wrong way. That night, I slept under a tree. No tent, no fire, just curled up in my bag, knife in hand. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't blink. And in the morning, I found something. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. Not mine. I started running then, limp and all. I ran until my lungs gave out, until my knee buckled. I don't know how long I kept going, but eventually I hit the road, stumbled out into the gravel like some drunk, fell. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked alone, but this time felt different. I had a sense of calm in my chest, a kind of quiet anticipation that usually came with exploring new places. The kind of stillness that seemed to settle over me when I stepped into nature's quiet embrace. I had been eyeing this trail for weeks. It wasn't a well-known spot. No park rangers posted nearby. No popular Instagram influencers showing off their views. It was a trail that snaked through dense woods, rising up a mountain and ending at a secluded, silent lake. The kind of place most people didn't go unless they were prepared to really get lost. I packed lightly, a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my phone. More for emergencies than anything else. I didn't plan on needing it, but I knew how quickly things could go wrong when you were deep in the woods. And despite the sense of peace, something in the back of my mind kept urging me to stay aware. The trailhead was at the edge of a small town, almost hidden behind a grove of thick oak trees. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. A couple of cars, a few worn-out hikers stretching out their legs, but nothing too crowded. I checked my gear one last time and started walking. The air smelled fresh, piney, and cool, the damp earth clinging to my shoes with each step. The path was narrow but clearly defined, the ground soft from the rain the night before. As I walked, the trees above created a thick canopy, filtering the sunlight in gentle patches, casting dappled shadows across the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization, cars on the distant road, voices from the few remaining hikers, faded away. The first hour was easy. The trail wound through some low hills, the ground only slightly uneven. My pace was steady, my thoughts wandering. I focused on the sounds of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional splash of a nearby stream. There was a comfort in the simplicity of it. Just me, the trail, and the forest. Then the path started to climb. Slowly at first, but then more steeply, cutting into the side of the mountain. The trail turned rocky, with roots snaking out of the earth like veins in a body. I had to watch my footing now, taking care not to slip on the slick stones or trip over a misstep. The trees were closer now, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches arching overhead like ancient, weathered hands reaching out. The higher I went, the more isolated it felt. I couldn't hear any other hikers, couldn't see any signs of life except for the occasional squirrel darting across the path. My breathing became heavier as I gained elevation, but I welcomed it. There was something about the challenge, something about pushing myself further into the wilderness, that felt right. After a while, I came to a fork in the trail. The sign was old, the letters faded, but it was still legible enough to read, Lakeview 1.5 miles. To the left, a narrow path veered deeper into the forest, marked by what appeared to be an old, forgotten sign. To the right, the well-worn trail continued upward toward the lake. I decided to follow the left fork, curious about the sign and eager to see where it led. The trail grew steeper. My legs burned with the effort, my heart thudding in my chest. The path became narrower, winding tighter between the trees. It felt like the woods were closing in around me, the air thick with the smell of moss and earth. There was no more sunlight filtering through the canopy now, only shadows. For the next hour, I trudged on, my thoughts occupied with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I noticed the trail beginning to disappear altogether. The rocks beneath my feet became larger, more treacherous, and the trees more sparse. I could see over the ridge now, the valley opening up below me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, staring out at the view. It was beautiful, untouched, pristine. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The feeling. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A kind of unease, like the forest itself was watching me. I shook the thought off. It was just my imagination. I had hiked alone many times before, and the woods were no stranger to me. I kept moving, taking slow, deliberate steps, carefully navigating the rocky outcrop. The trail had all but disappeared now, replaced by a jumble of loose rocks and crumbled dirt. The sense of isolation became more pronounced as I reached the top. There was no sign of the lake I was supposed to find, no hint of a clear path forward. The air had become dense, heavier than before. My breath felt shallow as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the lake. But the ground ahead was steep, with a drop to the left that would have been dangerous to traverse. A small ridge formed on the right, and beyond it, the land seemed to level out, but I couldn't see what was on the other side. The feeling of unease returned, stronger now, and I found myself staring at the ridge, wondering if I should risk climbing over it. I come this far after all, but something didn't sit right. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, a low, muffled rustling from behind me. It was barely audible at first, just the wind moving through the trees, but it grew louder, consistent noise, like footsteps. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing. No movement in the trees, no figure stepping through the underbrush. Yet, the sound was undeniable, a rhythmic thud, like someone following me, just out of sight. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down my back. The rational part of me tried to brush it off, but the hair on my neck stood on end. I turned quickly, scanning the path I had just come from. There was no one, nothing but the dense forest stretching back toward the trailhead. The rustling stopped, and the silence returned. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment settling over me. The uneasy feeling remained, but I couldn't explain it. I tried to push it aside, convinced that it was just my mind playing tricks. Deciding to continue was probably the worst choice I could have made, but I did. I turned back toward the ridge and began to climb, slowly and cautiously. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, each movement a calculated decision. When I reached the top, I peered over the edge, and there it was, the lake. But it was different than I had imagined. It was a shallow body of water, murky and dark, with the trees hanging low, their branches dipping into the water like fingers brushing the surface. It was stunning in its own way, but there was an eerie stillness to it. No movement, no life, just the cold, stagnant water reflecting the gray sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the air thicken around me. I didn't feel alone anymore. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body screamed to leave. I glanced back at the trail I had come from. It was distant now, and the path leading down to the lake was steep and difficult. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I suddenly realized I wasn't alone on the ridge. There was someone behind me. The sound was back, that faint rustling of leaves, but this time it was much closer. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, my heart racing in my chest. The trees blurred past me, the underbrush catching at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the rustling grow louder, faster. Whoever or whatever was following me was gaining ground. I didn't look back. I kept running, the weight of panic pushing me forward. The ground was slippery now, the rocks loose beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I refused to stop. I needed to get back to the trail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the fork where I had made my decision to follow the left path. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I took the familiar trail leading down the mountain, ignoring the way my body screamed for rest. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had begun to set. The woods were quiet again, the air still. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all or if I had really been followed, but as I pulled away in my car, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. The forest had its way of drawing people in, but it didn't let them leave without a trace. The sun had barely risen when I set out for my hike. I had taken the morning off from work, craving the solitude of the wilderness. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the desire to breathe in fresh air and escape the city for a while. The trailhead was located at the edge of a thick forest, a place I'd passed by a few times but never ventured into. That morning, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore. The air was cool and crisp as I started on the narrow dirt path. It felt peaceful, almost as if the forest was welcoming me. The trees stood tall around me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The ground was damp from the dew, and the smell of earth and pine filled my lungs with every breath. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the soft crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots. My thoughts drifted as I walked, my mind clearing from the stress of daily life. It was just me and the wilderness now, and for a while I felt completely at ease. I don't know how much time had passed when I noticed the trail becoming less defined. It was still visible, but the path was growing narrower, and the underbrush seemed to close in around me. I paused for a moment, looking around. I had planned on staying on the main trail, but it was becoming harder to follow. A part of me considered turning back, but the other part, the part that had been craving adventure, decided to press on. I figured I'd just keep going a little longer. Surely the trail would open up again soon. I pushed through the thicket, feeling the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders with every step. The further I went, the more isolated I became. The trees grew thicker, the air more still. It was as if the forest had taken me into its heart, away from the world I had known. Then I heard something. It wasn't a noise that would normally make me feel uneasy, a twig snapping or a soft rustle in the leaves, but it caught my attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was a definite sound of movement. I stood still, my breath catching in my chest. I glanced around, trying to spot any movement between the trees, but everything seemed still, too still. I shook off the unease, convincing myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a squirrel. I continued walking, but the sound lingered in my mind, like a shadow at the back of my thoughts. The path eventually led me to a small clearing. The trees parted slightly, allowing a sliver of sunlight to break through the canopy and illuminate the area. I stopped for a moment, taking in the view. There was a small stream at the edge of the clearing, its waters trickling over rocks. It was serene, the kind of place you'd picture in a painting. I could hear the soft gurgling of the water, the rustling of leaves, and nothing else. I knelt down beside the stream, cupping my hands to drink from it. The water was cold and refreshing, a stark contrast to the warmth creeping into the air. As I drank, I noticed something unusual on the far side of the clearing, a shape barely visible through the underbrush. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was a piece of cloth, a faded, torn scrap caught on a branch. For some reason, the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. There was something unsettling about it, like a silent message left behind. But I told myself I was overreacting. Just a bit of trash left by some careless hiker, nothing more. I stood up, shaking off the discomfort, and made my way toward the opposite side of the clearing. But as I approached the tree line, something else caught my eye, a mark on the bark of one of the trees. It was deep and jagged, as if something had scratched it violently. It wasn't a natural mark, like one from a deer's antlers. This was something different. I couldn't explain why, but my pulse quickened as I ran my fingers over the deep gouges. There was an unnatural sense of urgency building within me. It was as if the woods were growing heavier, more oppressive. I felt as though something was watching me, waiting. I backed away from the tree, my eyes scanning the area around me, trying to shake off the growing feeling of dread. The path ahead looked unchanged, yet the world seemed to have shifted in a way I couldn't explain. A sudden movement to my left made me freeze. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I was sure I saw something, or someone, darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned in the direction of the movement. Nothing, only trees, shadows, and the faint whisper of wind. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was just an animal, or perhaps the wind had shifted in a way that made the branches sway. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the hike felt different. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. The path seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I glanced over my shoulder more times than I could count, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind me. It wasn't until I saw the sun dipping low in the sky that I realized how far off the beaten path I had gone. The forest had swallowed me whole, and I had no idea how to retrace my steps. The familiar landmarks from earlier in the hike were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and underbrush. I had wandered too far. Panic started to set in. I checked my phone for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no GPS, just the cold, lonely silence of the forest. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could find my way back. But the more I walked, the more I felt like I was walking in circles. The trail had disappeared entirely, and now I was just wandering aimlessly, trying to find anything familiar. The sound of movement behind me returned, but this time it was louder, closer. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was following me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step seemed to echo. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a warning. I glanced behind me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching me. I didn't stop to confirm it. I just ran. The underbrush tore at my clothes as I pushed through, my breath ragged, my thoughts a blur. The world around me felt distorted, the trees and shadows closing in like a maze with no way out. Then, through the fog of panic, I saw something. A trail. A real trail this time, wide and clear, leading in the direction of the setting sun. I didn't hesitate. I followed it, my legs aching, my lungs burning with every step. The sound behind me faded, but I didn't slow down until I saw a break in the trees up ahead. A road, a parking lot, and the distant hum of civilization. I stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. I turned around to look back at the forest. It seemed peaceful from here, untouched. But I knew that something was there, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the trees. I didn't go back to the woods after that day. I left the area and never returned. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that the forest is still watching me. I haven't heard anything or seen anything since, but I don't think I ever want to go back to find out. I don't know what was following me that day, but I'm thankful I made it out. And as much as I long for the peace of nature, some parts of the wilderness are better left unexplored. The sun was high, but the trees swallowed most of the light. I had been hiking for hours, following the trail markers, little yellow squares nailed to the trunks. My boots crunched over dry leaves, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. I wasn't lost, at least not yet. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike through Blackridge Forest, just a day's journey, in and out. The map showed a clear loop, 8 miles total. Easy. I had water, a knife, a lighter, and a half-charged phone. Enough for a day. Enough to survive if something went wrong. But something did go wrong. The first sign was the silence. Birds had been chirping earlier, squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Now nothing, just the wind hissing through the branches. I slowed, listening. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bear, a coyote. I gripped my knife tighter and kept walking. Then I saw it. The trail marker was wrong. Not just faded or hard to see. Wrong. The yellow square was there, but the path it pointed to didn't match the map. The trail split, one side narrow and overgrown, the other wide and clear. The map showed no split. I checked my phone. No signal. I stood there, sweat cooling on my back. Maybe I had missed a turn. Maybe the markers were old. I took the wider path, felt safer. The trees closed in. The air got thicker, harder to breathe. My boots sank into mud where there shouldn't have been mud. The trail twisted, dipped, then vanished completely. No more markers, just wilderness. I turned back, or tried to. The path behind me didn't look the same. Had I really come this way? The trees all looked alike. Twisted oaks, their branches like skeletal fingers. I walked faster. My heart pounded. Then I heard it. A snap. Not a branch underfoot. Something bigger. Something moving just out of sight. I froze. My breath came in short bursts. I scanned the trees. Nothing. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I just needed to retrace my steps. Find the trail. Get out. But the forest didn't let me. The ground sloped downward, steep and slick with wet leaves. My foot slipped. I fell, tumbling, rolling, my backpack slamming against rocks. Pain shot through my side. I gasped, clutching my ribs. When I looked up, I was at the bottom of a ravine. No trail, no markers, just walls of dirt and roots. I stood, wincing. My water bottle was dented, but intact. My phone screen was cracked. Still no signal. The sun was lower now. Shadows stretched long and dark. I climbed, hand over hand, digging my fingers into the earth. My arms burned. My legs shook, but I made it to the top and saw nothing but trees. No trail, no sign of civilization, just endless forest. I checked my compass. North was that way. The parking lot was west. I started walking. Hours passed. The light faded. My throat was dry. I sipped water, rationing. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle, every creak of branches. Then, in the distance, a flicker. Light, not the sun. Artificial. A flashlight? A cabin? I ran. Branches whipped my face. My lungs burned. The light grew brighter. Closer. Then I saw it. A road. A real paved road. And a car, headlights on, engine running. I stumbled forward, waving my arms. The car slowed. Stopped. The window rolled down. A man's face, middle-aged, tired. "You all right?" I could have cried. "I got lost." He nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to town." I climbed into the passenger seat, the warmth of the heater hitting my skin. The man didn't ask questions, just drove. Through the window, I watched the forest blur into darkness. I was out. The sun was low in the sky when I started the hike. Golden light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I had done this trail before, a 6-mile loop through the woods, nothing too difficult. But this time I was alone. No friends, no phone signal, just me and the forest. I adjusted my backpack and kept walking. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of something small moving in the underbrush. Birds chirped now and then, but as the sun dipped lower, even they fell silent. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud where the ground was soft. Too big to be an animal, too clear to be old. Someone had been here recently. I stopped, staring at them. My skin prickled. I told myself it was just another hiker. But why would they be walking off the trail? The prints veered into the thick trees, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving faster now. The air grew cooler as the light faded. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers overhead. My breath came quicker, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then I heard it, a snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze, listened. Nothing, just the wind. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. But then another sound, a slow, deliberate rustling in the bushes to my left. Too heavy to be a squirrel, too quiet to be an accident. I didn't wait to see what it was. I walked faster, my boots thudding against the dirt. The trail curved, leading me deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their trunks thick and gnarled. The shadows stretched longer, swallowing the path ahead. Another sound, this time closer, a low, steady breathing, not mine. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see movement from the corner of my eye. A shape, dark and tall, standing between the trees. Watching me, my stomach dropped. I didn't run, not yet. Running meant panic. Running meant it would chase me. So I kept walking, my fingers tightening around the strap of my backpack. The thing didn't move, just stood there, silent. Then it took a step forward. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my arms. The thing behind me moved fast, too fast. I could hear it now, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me. My breath came in ragged gasps. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The trail forked. I took the left path without thinking, my boots slipping on wet leaves. The trees thinned slightly and I saw it. A steep drop ahead, a rocky slope leading down to a creek. No way across, no way back, I turned just as the figure emerged from the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden in shadow, stood there, blocking the path, watching me. I backed up, my heel hitting the edge of the slope. Rocks skittered down into the darkness below. One wrong step and I'd fall. The thing took another step toward me. I had no choice. I turned and jumped. The world spun as I tumbled down the slope, rocks biting into my skin. I hit the bottom hard, pain shooting up my leg. The creek was shallow, the water icy against my torn clothes. I dragged myself up, limping, my vision blurry. I looked back up the slope. The figure stood at the top, staring down. Then it turned and walked away. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I stumbled through the creek, the cold water numbing the pain. On the other side, I found another trail, narrower, less worn, but leading somewhere. I followed it, my body aching, my mind racing. The trees thinned, the sky lightened, and then finally I saw it, the parking lot. My car, the last bit of sunlight glinting off the windshield. I ran the last few steps, fumbling for my keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, away from the woods. I never went hiking alone again, and I never told anyone what I saw, because some things don't need ghosts or fairy tales to be terrifying. Some things are real. I hadn't been planning to hike alone that weekend. Originally, I was supposed to go with my cousin, but he backed out last minute with some excuse about a work thing, and I was already packed and restless from the week. The trail I chose, Switchback Ridge, wasn't far from home, about 3 hours northwest of where I live in southern Illinois. I'd read a blog post about it a few months earlier. The guy said it was peaceful, rarely crowded, and offered an incredible overlook if you stuck it out to the top. The name came from the way the trail cut back and forth steeply up the mountainside. I figured a little solitude might be good. I'm used to the woods. I've hiked alone before. This wasn't supposed to be anything different. I got to the trailhead just after 10 a.m. on a Saturday. It was early October, mid-60s, overcast, a little wind, perfect hiking weather. The gravel parking lot was empty when I pulled in, which honestly made me feel good. I didn't want to run into anyone. I wasn't out there to chat or make friends. I just needed to breathe. The quiet was thick, almost heavy, in the way only the woods can feel. I tightened the straps on my pack, locked my car, double-checked the gear. Extra water, first aid kit, knife, map, flashlight, food, space blanket, even a small emergency bivvy. I'm cautious like that, not paranoid, just careful. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail started flat, winding through dense underbrush and tall pines. The air had that damp, earthy smell I've always liked. I could hear birds now and then, the distant crack of branches moving in the breeze, nothing else. No voices, no traffic, no engines. I passed a small creek around mile 2 and stopped to refill my bottle using my filter. I took a few pictures, nothing fancy, just the kind of stuff I usually snap for my own memory's sake. The woods felt alive but not threatening. I kept moving. By midday, I'd hit the first of the steep climbs. The switchbacks came one after another, carving tight turns into the hill. The dirt was packed tight, lined with dry leaves and roots that tried to trip me every few steps. I kept a steady pace, slow and even, trying not to sweat too much. I knew the nights could get cold, and I didn't want to be damp when the temperature dropped. I'd planned to camp near the top and finish the hike the next day. About 5 hours in, I stopped to rest. I found a flat spot just off the trail with a rock big enough to sit on and pulled out some trail mix and jerky. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived, which didn't feel strange at the time. It just felt quiet. That kind of silence gets into your head after a while, makes you start hearing things that aren't there. I chewed slowly, listening. Wind in the trees, leaves rustling. I swear I heard a twig snap somewhere downhill, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, probably a squirrel. I pressed on. The trail got narrower as I climbed, more overgrown. At times, it was barely more than a game path. A few spots were washed out, and I had to step carefully to avoid sliding down loose rock. At one point, I used a downed tree to climb up a steep incline where the trail had eroded completely. I remember thinking it was odd that the trail wasn't better maintained, considering how well-reviewed it had been. But I shrugged it off. Not all trails are groomed. Some just fade with time. The sun started dipping lower, and the light shifted to that deep, gold-tinged hue that tells you it's time to find camp. I came across a small clearing not far from the ridgeline, tucked behind a cluster of boulders. It was just big enough for my tent and had a decent view to the west. I set up quickly, stretched my legs, and took a short walk to a nearby outcrop to see the sunset. It was stunning, layers of trees fading into the distance, orange sky melting into blue. I stood there a while, breathing deep. No thoughts, just a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a while. Back at camp, I boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal, ate, and cleaned up. I hung the food bag a ways off, tied it high between two trees like I always do. The air dropped fast after the sun was gone. I pulled on my thermal layer and crawled into the tent. I read for a bit by flashlight. Nothing intense, just a paperback I'd brought along, and tried to sleep. It took a while, but eventually I drifted off. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. There was no noise. That's what got me. No wind, no bugs, no rustling leaves, just silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from calm weather. It was dead, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed still for a minute, listening, straining my ears. Then I heard it, a crunch. Not a sharp crack like a branch breaking, just a deliberate, weighty crunch of dry leaves underfoot. One step, then another, slow, measured, heavy. My heart picked up, and I eased up onto one elbow, trying not to make noise. The tent was zipped. The rainfly was on. Couldn't see out. I clicked my flashlight on but kept it pointed down, not wanting to give away my position. My knife was in my boot near the door. I reached for it slowly. Another step. Closer now. Definitely a human step. Bipedal. Not an animal. I held my breath. Waited. The step stopped just outside the clearing. Nothing. 10 seconds. 20. Full minute. Then one more step. Just one. And then silence again. I sat there, heart pounding, barely blinking. No voices. No lights. Just the dark and that thick silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, I heard movement again, this time receding. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't call out, just turned and left, crunching softly back into the woods. After that, I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, didn't even boil water. I just grabbed my gear, stuffed it all back in the bag, and started heading down. The forest felt different now, still quiet, still strange. I kept my knife in my hand the whole way, even though my hand was sweating so much I had to wipe it off on my pants every few minutes. About an hour into the descent, I noticed something that hadn't been there on the way up. A pile of stones, right beside the trail, neatly stacked. Not natural. Maybe someone's marker? I wasn't sure. I kept moving. A little while later, I saw another one. Same kind of stack. 5 stones carefully placed, balanced. Another mile. The third one. It was starting to feel deliberate now, like someone wanted them to be seen. I hadn't seen these on the way up. I would have noticed. I'm observant like that. It made my skin crawl. I picked up my pace. By midday, I was about halfway down. That's when I saw it. A backpack, just sitting there on the side of the trail. Older than mine. Faded green canvas. Zippers rusted. Torn in one spot. Looked like it had been there a while, but not rotted, just weathered. I stood there staring at it for what felt like 10 minutes. Finally, I forced myself to approach. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity, maybe. I nudged it with my foot. It was empty. No ID, no supplies, nothing. Just abandoned. I didn't touch it again. I just kept moving. By late afternoon, I was nearing the bottom. The trail widened again, and I could hear water flowing. Probably the same creek I'd passed the day before. I started to feel a bit better. Like whatever that was last night, whoever it was, hadn't followed. But I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just walked. Then I saw the prints. Fresh ones. boot prints just ahead of mine, coming from the opposite direction, heading up. Big, wide, and deep. Someone had come up the trail not long before I got there. But I hadn't seen anyone. Not on the way up. Not when I camped. Not when I came down. And yet those prints had to be new. Had to be today. My gut turned. I started running. The last half mile flew by. My pack bounced hard against my back. My legs burned. My breath came ragged. But I didn't care. I just ran. When I finally saw my car, I almost didn't believe it was real. But it was. I unlocked it, threw everything in, slammed the door shut, and peeled out of that gravel lot faster than I've ever left a trail in my life. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and even then, I kept going another 30 miles before I pulled over at a gas station to breathe. I sat there, engine off, windows up, heart still racing. I'll never know who was out there. Maybe a hunter, though it's not hunting land. Maybe another hiker, though they didn't act like one. Maybe someone who lives off the grid. Maybe worse. I didn't report it. What would I say? I heard footsteps, saw a backpack, and found some rocks. I've been on plenty of hikes since. But I don't go alone anymore. Not after Switchback Ridge. Not after that night. Some places just feel wrong. And some people don't want to be found. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being in nature that brings a sense of peace. The fresh air, the quiet. Sometimes it feels like I'm part of something bigger than myself. But this trip, it was different. I could feel it before I even started, though I couldn't place why. Maybe it was because the weather had been unusually warm for autumn, or maybe it was just one of those days where things don't feel quite right. Whatever it was, I ignored it, shrugged it off, and packed my bag with the usual gear. Water, snacks, a few layers of clothing, and a first aid kit. I was heading into a new trail, one that was known for its beauty, a few hours north of the town where I live. A place I'd never been before, but I was excited to see. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. It was early in the morning, and I was the only car in the small parking area. The air was still, not a breath of wind. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't too bad. Just enough to make me pull on my jacket. The map at the trailhead showed a long loop that I thought would take me a good portion of the day to finish. The elevation wasn't too crazy, but the map warned of a few tricky spots. The first part of the trail was easy enough. A wide, dirt path wound through a small grove of trees. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the ground, and the leaves, which had started to change colors, crunched beneath my boots. The silence was thick, but in a peaceful way, like the world was holding its breath. I'd been hiking for about an hour when the path started to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling in a way that blocked the sun more and more. The path wasn't clearly marked anymore, and I had to keep an eye on the ground to stay on track. The woods here felt different, darker, quieter. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched, though I knew it was probably just my imagination. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I tried to push the thought away. I kept going. The further I went, the more the trail twisted. It wasn't as much of a path now as a series of small, uneven steps made by countless hikers before me. The dirt was slick in places, and there were thick roots jutting up from the ground that I had to carefully step over. The woods closed in tighter around me, and the sun, now higher in the sky, barely made it through the canopy. It felt like the temperature had dropped a few degrees, but I wasn't cold. My mind was starting to race, though. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my steps. I wasn't lost. I knew where I was, just a few miles from the parking lot, according to the map. But as I moved, I began to notice things that weren't quite right. The sound, the stillness of it all. There were no birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The air felt thick, like something was holding its breath, waiting. And then there was the smell, a faint, sour stench that I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was just wet leaves, but it lingered in a way that made my stomach turn. It wasn't until I passed a pile of broken branches and found a patch of disturbed earth that I realized it was something more. The ground there was darker than the rest of the soil, and there were patches of something off. My mind jumped to the worst conclusion: animal remains. But I didn't want to think about it. I pushed forward, trying not to look too closely. The path took me deeper into the woods. The light seemed to dim even more, like the trees were closing in above me. My pace quickened, though I wasn't sure why. I felt like I should hurry, but there was no logical reason for it. It wasn't long before I reached a clearing. I could hear the distant sound of running water. Probably a stream, I thought. The clearing itself was strange, though. The ground here was unusually soft, like the soil had been churned up recently. The plants in the area were sparse, as if they had been trampled. And then I saw it. Up ahead, just beyond the clearing, there was a small structure. At first, I thought it was a cabin, but it was too dilapidated. The roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in moss, but there was no mistaking it. A small, abandoned cabin. Curiosity pushed me forward. What was it doing here out in the middle of nowhere? It wasn't on the map, and I had certainly never heard anyone mention it. It was the kind of place you would expect to find stories about, but not in a way that seemed real. I told myself it was just an old, forgotten shelter for hikers from years ago, maybe even a hunting cabin. But something about it felt wrong. I had no real reason to go toward it, but my legs moved on their own. The closer I got, the more the unease settled into my chest. The cabin was smaller than I expected, barely standing, with only 3 walls still intact. The windows were dark, as though the place had been abandoned for decades. I stood there for a moment, just watching it. I considered walking away, but something pulled me toward the door, even though I couldn't have explained why. The moment I touched the old wooden frame, I felt a rush of cold air, as though the structure had been holding it in all this time. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, and the light barely filtered through the grimy windows. There was nothing inside but dust, broken furniture, and old, yellowed paper strewn across the floor. As I stood there, surveying the room, I noticed something else, something that made my heart rate spike. A small, crumpled piece of paper sat on the floor near the back wall. I picked it up. The writing was smudged, but it was legible enough. A few words stood out. Asterisk, don't go further. They're watching. Asterisk. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I turned quickly, my heart thumping in my chest. There was nothing, no one, yet I felt like I wasn't alone. I shoved the paper into my pocket, stepped out of the cabin, and looked around the clearing. And that's when I saw it. Across the clearing, at the edge of the tree line, I noticed movement. Something large and dark, something watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure standing in the shadows. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination, or if I was seeing things that weren't there. I turned back to the cabin, half tempted to run. But there was something pulling me forward, a strange urge to leave the way I had come. I forced myself to walk away, slowly, deliberately, taking one step after another. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following mine. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch of dirt, like someone was walking behind me. I kept my pace steady, trying not to panic, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I didn't dare look back. The rest of the hike passed in a blur. The woods felt tighter, darker. My legs were aching, and my mind was racing with thoughts I couldn't shake. I didn't stop, didn't look for water, didn't check my map. The thought of that figure, of the message on the paper, gnawed at me. By the time I reached the end of the trail, I could hear the distant sound of the parking lot. My heart slowed. The weight of the forest lifted. I didn't stop to look around. I didn't glance back. I just walked. And when I got to my car, I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, but I could still feel the eyes on me. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked alone, but this time felt different. I had a sense of calm in my chest, a kind of quiet anticipation that usually came with exploring new places. The kind of stillness that seemed to settle over me when I stepped into nature's quiet embrace. I had been eyeing this trail for weeks. It wasn't a well-known spot. No park rangers posted nearby. No popular Instagram influencers showing off their views. It was a trail that snaked through dense woods, rising up a mountain and ending at a secluded, silent lake. The kind of place most people didn't go unless they were prepared to really get lost. I packed lightly, a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my phone. More for emergencies than anything else. I didn't plan on needing it, but I knew how quickly things could go wrong when you were deep in the woods. And despite the sense of peace, something in the back of my mind kept urging me to stay aware. The trailhead was at the edge of a small town, almost hidden behind a grove of thick oak trees. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. A couple of cars, a few worn-out hikers stretching out their legs, but nothing too crowded. I checked my gear one last time and started walking. The air smelled fresh, piney, and cool, the damp earth clinging to my shoes with each step. The path was narrow but clearly defined, the ground soft from the rain the night before. As I walked, the trees above created a thick canopy, filtering the sunlight in gentle patches, casting dappled shadows across the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization, cars on the distant road, voices from the few remaining hikers, faded away. The first hour was easy. The trail wound through some low hills, the ground only slightly uneven. My pace was steady, my thoughts wandering. I focused on the sounds of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional splash of a nearby stream. There was a comfort in the simplicity of it. Just me, the trail, and the forest. Then the path started to climb. Slowly at first, but then more steeply, cutting into the side of the mountain. The trail turned rocky, with roots snaking out of the earth like veins in a body. I had to watch my footing now, taking care not to slip on the slick stones or trip over a misstep. The trees were closer now, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches arching overhead like ancient, weathered hands reaching out. The higher I went, the more isolated it felt. I couldn't hear any other hikers, couldn't see any signs of life except for the occasional squirrel darting across the path. My breathing became heavier as I gained elevation, but I welcomed it. There was something about the challenge, something about pushing myself further into the wilderness, that felt right. After a while, I came to a fork in the trail. The sign was old, the letters faded, but it was still legible enough to read, Lakeview 1.5 miles. To the left, a narrow path veered deeper into the forest, marked by what appeared to be an old, forgotten sign. To the right, the well-worn trail continued upward toward the lake. I decided to follow the left fork, curious about the sign and eager to see where it led. The trail grew steeper. My legs burned with the effort, my heart thudding in my chest. The path became narrower, winding tighter between the trees. It felt like the woods were closing in around me, the air thick with the smell of moss and earth. There was no more sunlight filtering through the canopy now, only shadows. For the next hour, I trudged on, my thoughts occupied with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I noticed the trail beginning to disappear altogether. The rocks beneath my feet became larger, more treacherous, and the trees more sparse. I could see over the ridge now, the valley opening up below me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, staring out at the view. It was beautiful, untouched, pristine. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The feeling. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A kind of unease, like the forest itself was watching me. I shook the thought off. It was just my imagination. I had hiked alone many times before, and the woods were no stranger to me. I kept moving, taking slow, deliberate steps, carefully navigating the rocky outcrop. The trail had all but disappeared now, replaced by a jumble of loose rocks and crumbled dirt. The sense of isolation became more pronounced as I reached the top. There was no sign of the lake I was supposed to find, no hint of a clear path forward. The air had become dense, heavier than before. My breath felt shallow as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the lake. But the ground ahead was steep, with a drop to the left that would have been dangerous to traverse. A small ridge formed on the right, and beyond it, the land seemed to level out, but I couldn't see what was on the other side. The feeling of unease returned, stronger now, and I found myself staring at the ridge, wondering if I should risk climbing over it. I come this far after all, but something didn't sit right. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, a low, muffled rustling from behind me. It was barely audible at first, just the wind moving through the trees. But it grew louder, consistent noise, like footsteps. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing. No movement in the trees, no figure stepping through the underbrush. Yet, the sound was undeniable, a rhythmic thud, like someone following me, just out of sight. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down my back. The rational part of me tried to brush it off, but the hair on my neck stood on end. I turned quickly, scanning the path I had just come from. There was no one, nothing but the dense forest stretching back toward the trailhead. The rustling stopped, and the silence returned. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment settling over me. The uneasy feeling remained, but I couldn't explain it. I tried to push it aside, convinced that it was just my mind playing tricks. Deciding to continue was probably the worst choice I could have made. But I did. I turned back toward the ridge and began to climb, slowly and cautiously. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, each movement a calculated decision. When I reached the top, I peered over the edge, and there it was, the lake. But it was different than I had imagined. It was a shallow body of water, murky and dark, with the trees hanging low, their branches dipping into the water like fingers brushing the surface. It was stunning in its own way, but there was an eerie stillness to it. No movement, no life, just the cold, stagnant water reflecting the gray sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the air thicken around me. I didn't feel alone anymore. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body screamed to leave. I glanced back at the trail I had come from. It was distant now, and the path leading down to the lake was steep and difficult. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I suddenly realized I wasn't alone on the ridge. There was someone behind me. The sound was back, that faint rustling of leaves, but this time it was much closer. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, my heart racing in my chest. The trees blurred past me, the underbrush catching at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the rustling grow louder, faster. Whoever or whatever was following me was gaining ground. I didn't look back. I kept running, the weight of panic pushing me forward. The ground was slippery now, the rocks loose beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I refused to stop. I needed to get back to the trail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the fork where I had made my decision to follow the left path. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I took the familiar trail leading down the mountain, ignoring the way my body screamed for rest. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had begun to set. The woods were quiet again, the air still. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all or if I had really been followed, but as I pulled away in my car, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. The forest had its way of drawing people in, but it didn't let them leave without a trace. The sun was low on the horizon as I laced up my boots and adjusted the straps on my backpack. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks, an escape from the noise, from the pressure of life that seemed to always chase me. Just me, the trail, and the deep, wild woods. No distractions, no one else around. I craved the quiet. The trail I chose was one I had passed by a few times before but had never ventured down. It wound through the woods, cutting its way through dense underbrush, up and down rolling hills. I'd heard rumors that it wasn't well maintained, but that only added to the appeal. I wanted the challenge, I studied the map carefully. The trail wasn't long, maybe 4 or 5 miles to the nearest overlook, and I'd planned to get back before sunset. At least that was the plan. As I set off, the sound of the world, cars, people, my own restless thoughts, began to fade. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. The trail was narrow, and the dirt crunched under my boots. I felt at peace for the first time in weeks, the familiar rhythm of my steps grounding me. The path dipped downhill almost immediately, the trees surrounding me thickening, their trunks towering high above. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, but it wasn't the symphony of sounds I had imagined. Felt different, not quite empty, but strange. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was more like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. The weight of the air, damp with moisture, seemed to press in on me. I shook the thought off and focused on the trail ahead. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail grew less defined. More overgrown, the brush pressing in from both sides. I had to push through thick ferns and low branches that reached out like hands trying to pull me in. I checked the map again. According to the markers, I was still on track, though the path felt increasingly less like a trail and more like an animal's path. Narrow, winding, and unpredictable. The sun was barely visible now, obscured by the canopy overhead. The light was fading, but I wasn't concerned. I had plenty of time to reach the overlook and head back before nightfall. That's when I noticed it. A small, unmarked sign was wedged between 2 trees just off to the side of the trail. The wood was weathered, its paint chipped and peeling, but the message was still clear: "Do not enter." The words were scrawled in a crude, jagged handwriting, like someone had hurriedly scratched them into the wood. I stopped, staring at it for a moment. My heart rate kicked up a bit, but it wasn't fear, more curiosity. I was alone here, so who would stop me? No one had been around when I started the hike, and no one would likely be out here now. I had come for an adventure, after all. The unknown, the wild. Wasn't that what I was seeking? The temptation was too strong. The sign seemed like a warning, like it was meant to keep people out. That kind of thing always made me want to go in. The trouble was, I wasn't sure why. I stepped off the main path, my boots crunching through the undergrowth. The woods were eerily quiet as I moved past the sign and into the dense trees. The air felt thicker, heavier here, like the ground was more solid and the branches above blocked the air from moving. The trail here, if it could even be called that, was faint. Just a few marks on the ground, a line of disturbed dirt, some fallen branches. It wasn't as if it was well worn, like the main trail, but I pushed on. Anyway, after all, what was the worst that could happen? The trees grew denser as I moved further in. The forest floor, once soft with moss, had turned to hard earth, the roots of ancient trees crisscrossing beneath the surface. The path twisted and turned in a way that didn't make sense, no clear direction, just an unpredictable curve. And then it happened. I heard a noise, something shifting in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I wasn't alone, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. The woods were still. No animals, no birds, no sign of life other than the wind that whispered through the branches. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just an animal. But then I heard it again, a branch snapping. This time it was closer. I was aware of the rising tension in the air, a slow pressure building up. I felt like the woods were closing in on me, like something was watching, something was waiting. I instinctively reached for my phone, but when I pulled it out, I saw there was no service. That should have been expected, but it unsettled me nonetheless. Another snap of a twig, louder now. I looked around again, my senses on high alert. Nothing, not even the usual rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the forest had fallen silent. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to move, ready to run if I needed to. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. Just a squirrel, maybe a deer. This was ridiculous. I tried to calm myself, pushing forward despite the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. But the further I went, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand. The path twisted more, and then I saw something, clearing ahead. A large, open space with rocks in the center, like an old, forgotten campsite. When I stepped into the clearing, my heart stopped. There was something about the place that felt wrong. The rocks, though natural, were arranged in a strange pattern, unnatural, almost deliberate. A large, flat stone lay at the center, like a makeshift altar. And then I noticed something else. The ground around the rocks was disturbed, like something had been dragged through the dirt. Deep gouges marred the earth, leading off toward a small grove of trees at the far side of the clearing. I took a deep breath, feeling a bead of sweat slide down the back of my neck. The temperature seemed to drop. The air was thick and stifling. I could hear nothing, not even the usual hum of insects or the occasional bird call. This didn't feel like a normal campsite. This wasn't just the woods anymore. It was something else, something older. And it was watching me. I turned to leave, my instinct screaming at me to get out. But before I could take a step, I heard it again. The unmistakable crack of a branch. But this time it was loud, clear, and unmistakably close. My heart slammed against my chest as I spun around. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. Tall, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. The way the air around it seemed to freeze, like the world held its breath. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, not once. I pushed through the thick underbrush, the trail now completely gone, only the sense of urgency in my chest guiding me. I could feel it behind me, closer every second. The sound of footsteps crunching on the ground, not my own. I ran faster, breath coming in short bursts. I don't know how long I ran. My legs burned, and I stumbled twice, but I kept going, driven by fear alone. And then, when I thought I couldn't go another step, I broke through the trees and found myself back on the main trail. I didn't stop. I kept running, faster now, until I finally saw the familiar path leading to the parking area. I didn't look back again. The air was still, the kind of quiet that wraps around you, making you feel like every breath you take is too loud. The trees, tall and heavy with moss, stood like sentinels on either side of the narrow trail. It had rained earlier, and the damp earth beneath my boots felt soft, squishy, almost too soft. The ground seemed to swallow the sound of my steps, muffling the rhythm of my breathing. I had come out here alone. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, one of those I need to get away days. I'd picked a trail that wasn't particularly popular, one that veered off the beaten path just enough to be secluded but not so isolated that I'd lose track of where I was. At least that's what I thought when I started out. The forest was dense, the kind where the sunlight barely touched the ground. I was used to hiking, but even so, there was something different about today. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to crowd in closer than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, though the thought was ridiculous. The path was wide enough for me to feel like I was the only one there. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, like something was darting between the trunks of the trees, just out of reach. I pushed the thought away. It wasn't unusual for animals to be around, squirrels, maybe a deer, or even a coyote. That wasn't what unnerved me. It was the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. I'd been walking for a couple of hours when the trail took a sharp bend, leading me down into a small ravine. The path was much narrower here, and the slope on either side was steep, with loose rocks and undergrowth threatening to trip me up. I paused at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the creek that ran along the bottom. The water was low, but there were deep, dark pools where the sunlight barely reached. A couple of fallen trees lay across the creek, acting as natural bridges. I stood there for a moment, listening to the water, and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. The creek, with its slow, meandering flow, looked like something from a storybook. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stepped forward, my boots slipping slightly on the wet rocks, but I steadied myself and made my way down into the ravine. The further I walked, the thicker the trees became. The air grew cooler, and the only sounds were the distant rush of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt like I was walking deeper into some forgotten part of the world, a place where time didn't matter and the past was buried beneath the roots of the trees. That was when I heard it, a crunch like a footstep on dry leaves. It was loud, and it wasn't the sound of an animal moving. It was deliberate, slow. My heart skipped and I froze, listening. Nothing. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I chalked it up to the wind, or maybe a branch snapping, but I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I pushed on, though now every step seemed to take more effort. The trail was becoming steeper, and I had to focus on where I was placing my feet. The last thing I wanted was to trip and fall down the ravine. As I rounded another bend, I noticed something strange. There was an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. It was weathered, the paint chipped and peeling, but it was still legible enough to make out the words, "No trespassing." I frowned, confused. I hadn't seen any other signs like this when I started, and I wasn't on a restricted trail. At least not according to the map. I paused for a second, debating whether I should turn back, but I decided to press on. I didn't think the sign meant anything. It could have been there for years, for all I knew. Maybe it was just part of some old logging area. I continued, but now I was more cautious. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, and I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that I wasn't alone. The trail had narrowed even further, and the trees on either side were so close I had to push branches out of my face to keep moving forward. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was also an odd, metallic scent, like rust or old iron. I stopped, sniffing the air, but couldn't place it. I looked around, but everything seemed still, too still. I kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct. The unmistakable sound of something or someone walking behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The path stretched out behind me, empty and silent. I could see nothing in the woods on either side. My breath came in shallow bursts as I tried to calm myself. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer, or my own footsteps echoing back to me. But even as I told myself that, the unease lingered. The trail soon began to level out, and I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. A broken-down shack sat in the center, its roof caved in and the windows boarded up. The sight of it caught me off guard. I had been expecting something like this, not out here in the middle of nowhere. I approached it cautiously, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The shack seemed ancient, untouched for years, maybe decades. But there was something unsettling about it, an odd sense that it was more than just abandoned. I stood there for a moment, staring at the shack, before deciding to continue on. My mind was racing. What was I doing out here? Why had I come this far? The way back seemed long, but there was something about this place that felt wrong, as if the land itself was rejecting me. I turned to leave, but then I heard something. A soft rustling noise, almost like a whisper, coming from behind the shack. I stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach twisted, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. My first instinct was to turn and run, but I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, unable to move, as though some invisible force was holding me there. Then it came again, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. My feet moved before my mind could process it, and I found myself slowly walking toward the sound. The closer I got to the shack, the more intense the noise became. It sounded like breathing? No, that couldn't be it. The door to the shack creaked as it swung open on its own. I froze. Everything in me screamed to turn around, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I stood there, staring at the dark interior, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was inside, something that didn't belong in the woods. Then I saw it, a hand, pale and bony, reaching out from the doorway. I didn't wait another second. I ran. My legs moved faster than they had ever moved before, pounding against the earth as I raced down the path. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The feeling of being chased, of being hunted, pushed me forward. The trail blurred as I ran, the trees and rocks all merging together in a dizzying whirl. I heard something behind me, but I refused to turn around. Couldn't. Every fiber of my being told me to keep going, to not stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods and back onto the main trail. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs aching with every step. I didn't slow down until I reached the parking lot, where my car sat, waiting. I didn't know what had happened back there or what I had seen, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I got in my car, slammed the door shut, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was on the road, miles away from that forest, that I realized I had forgotten to grab my map. I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't ever going back. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked alone, but this time felt different. I had a sense of calm in my chest, a kind of quiet anticipation that usually came with exploring new places. The kind of stillness that seemed to settle over me when I stepped into nature's quiet embrace. I had been eyeing this trail for weeks. It wasn't a well-known spot. No park rangers posted nearby. No popular Instagram influencers showing off their views. It was a trail that snaked through dense woods, rising up a mountain and ending at a secluded, silent lake. The kind of place most people didn't go unless they were prepared to really get lost. I packed lightly, a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my phone. More for emergencies than anything else. I didn't plan on needing it, but I knew how quickly things could go wrong when you were deep in the woods. And despite the sense of peace, something in the back of my mind kept urging me to stay aware. The trailhead was at the edge of a small town, almost hidden behind a grove of thick oak trees. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. A couple of cars, a few worn-out hikers stretching out their legs, but nothing too crowded. I checked my gear one last time and started walking. The air smelled fresh, piney, and cool, the damp earth clinging to my shoes with each step. The path was narrow but clearly defined, the ground soft from the rain the night before. As I walked, the trees above created a thick canopy, filtering the sunlight in gentle patches, casting dappled shadows across the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization, cars on the distant road, voices from the few remaining hikers, faded away. The first hour was easy. The trail wound through some low hills, the ground only slightly uneven. My pace was steady, my thoughts wandering. I focused on the sounds of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional splash of a nearby stream. There was a comfort in the simplicity of it. Just me, the trail, and the forest. Then the path started to climb. Slowly at first, but then more steeply, cutting into the side of the mountain. The trail turned rocky, with roots snaking out of the earth like veins in a body. I had to watch my footing now, taking care not to slip on the slick stones or trip over a misstep. The trees were closer now, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches arching overhead like ancient, weathered hands reaching out. The higher I went, the more isolated it felt. I couldn't hear any other hikers, couldn't see any signs of life except for the occasional squirrel darting across the path. My breathing became heavier as I gained elevation, but I welcomed it. There was something about the challenge, something about pushing myself further into the wilderness, that felt right. After a while, I came to a fork in the trail. The sign was old, the letters faded, but it was still legible enough to read, Lakeview 1.5 miles. To the left, a narrow path veered deeper into the forest, marked by what appeared to be an old, forgotten sign. To the right, the well-worn trail continued upward toward the lake. I decided to follow the left fork, curious about the sign and eager to see where it led. The trail grew steeper. My legs burned with the effort, my heart thudding in my chest. The path became narrower, winding tighter between the trees. It felt like the woods were closing in around me, the air thick with the smell of moss and earth. There was no more sunlight filtering through the canopy now, only shadows. For the next hour, I trudged on, my thoughts occupied with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I noticed the trail beginning to disappear altogether. The rocks beneath my feet became larger, more treacherous, and the trees more sparse. I could see over the ridge now, the valley opening up below me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, staring out at the view. It was beautiful, untouched, pristine. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite place. A feeling. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A kind of unease, like the forest itself was watching me. I shook the thought off. It was just my imagination. I had hiked alone many times before, and the woods were no stranger to me. I kept moving, taking slow, deliberate steps, carefully navigating the rocky outcrop. The trail had all but disappeared now, replaced by a jumble of loose rocks and crumbled dirt. The sense of isolation became more pronounced as I reached the top. There was no sign of the lake I was supposed to find, no hint of a clear path forward. The air had become dense, heavier than before. My breath felt shallow as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the lake. But the ground ahead was steep, with a drop to the left that would have been dangerous to traverse. A small ridge formed on the right, and beyond it, the land seemed to level out, but I couldn't see what was on the other side. The feeling of unease returned, stronger now, and I found myself staring at the ridge, wondering if I should risk climbing over it. I come this far after all, but something didn't sit right. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, a low, muffled rustling from behind me. It was barely audible at first, just the wind moving through the trees. But it grew louder, consistent noise, like footsteps. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing. No movement in the trees, no figure stepping through the underbrush. Yet, the sound was undeniable, a rhythmic thud, like someone following me, just out of sight. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down my back. The rational part of me tried to brush it off, but the hair on my neck stood on end. I turned quickly, scanning the path I had just come from. There was no one, nothing but the dense forest stretching back toward the trailhead. The rustling stopped, and the silence returned. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment settling over me. The uneasy feeling remained, but I couldn't explain it. I tried to push it aside, convinced that it was just my mind playing tricks. Deciding to continue was probably the worst choice I could have made. But I did. I turned back toward the ridge and began to climb, slowly and cautiously. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, each movement a calculated decision. When I reached the top, I peered over the edge, and there it was, the lake. But it was different than I had imagined. It was a shallow body of water, murky and dark, with the trees hanging low, their branches dipping into the water like fingers brushing the surface. It was stunning in its own way, but there was an eerie stillness to it. No movement, no life, just the cold, stagnant water reflecting the gray sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the air thicken around me. I didn't feel alone anymore. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body screamed to leave. I glanced back at the trail I had come from. It was distant now, and the path leading down to the lake was steep and difficult. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I suddenly realized I wasn't alone on the ridge. There was someone behind me. The sound was back, that faint rustling of leaves, but this time it was much closer. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, my heart racing in my chest. The trees blurred past me, the underbrush catching at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the rustling grow louder, faster. Whoever or whatever was following me was gaining ground. I didn't look back. I kept running, the weight of panic pushing me forward. The ground was slippery now, the rocks loose beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I refused to stop. I needed to get back to the trail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the fork where I had made my decision to follow the left path. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I took the familiar trail leading down the mountain, ignoring the way my body screamed for rest. By the time I reached the parking lot, the The sun had begun to set. The woods were quiet again, the air still. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all or if I had really been followed, but as I pulled away in my car, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. The forest had its way of drawing people in, but it didn't let them leave without a trace. I had always been drawn to the allure of the wilderness, the promise of solitude, the challenge of the unknown, and the chance to disconnect from the relentless pace of modern life. Living in Fort Monroe, Punjab, Pakistan, I was surrounded by rugged landscapes that beckoned adventurers. The Sulayman Range, with its undulating hills and deep valleys, was a familiar playground for me. Yet, despite my experience, I was about to learn that nature's unpredictability could humble even the most seasoned hikers. It was early April, and the weather had begun to warm, making it an ideal time for a solo trek. I had my sights set on a less traveled path that meandered through the heart of the Sulayman Range. The trail was known for its breathtaking vistas and challenging terrain, a perfect combination for someone seeking both beauty and adventure. I spent the evening before my departure meticulously preparing my gear. My backpack was packed with essentials: a map of the area, compass, first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, a multi-tool, and enough food and water to last me 2 days. I also carried a lightweight tent and a sleeping bag, anticipating a night under the stars. My attire consisted of moisture-wicking layers, sturdy hiking boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield me from the sun. At dawn, I set out from my home, the cool morning air invigorating my senses. The trailhead was a short drive away, and by 7 a.m., I was on foot, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots signaling the start of my journey. The path began with a gentle incline, winding through clusters of acacia trees and patches of wildflowers that had begun to bloom with the arrival of spring. As the hours passed, the trail grew steeper and more rugged. Loose rocks and narrow ledges demanded my full attention, and I moved with deliberate caution. Despite the challenges, I felt a profound sense of peace envelop me. The only sounds were the rhythmic cadence of my footsteps, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the whisper of the wind through the valleys. By midday, I reached a plateau that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. I decided it was an opportune moment to rest and refuel. I found a flat rock to sit on, removed my backpack, and retrieved a sandwich and a bottle of water. As I ate, I marveled at the vastness before me. The undulating ridges stretching endlessly, their peaks kissed by wisps of clouds. After a brief respite, I resumed my trek, descending from the plateau into a densely forested valley. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was cooler here, and the scent of pine and damp earth was intoxicating. I navigated the winding path, stepping over exposed roots and sidestepping patches of mud left by recent rains. As afternoon waned, I approached a narrow gorge that I needed to cross to continue on my planned route. A shallow stream flowed through it, its clear waters revealing smooth stones beneath. The gorge's walls were steep, composed of loose soil and jagged rocks. I paused to assess the best point to descend and ascend the other side. I chose a section where the slope appeared less severe and began my descent carefully, testing each foothold before committing my weight. About halfway down, the ground beneath me gave way without warning. A section of the slope had eroded, and I found myself sliding uncontrollably. Instinctively, I reached out to grab anything that might halt my descent, but my fingers grasped only loose soil and small rocks. I landed hard at the base of the gorge, the impact jarring my entire body. Pain shot through my left ankle, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Gritting my teeth, I sat up and gingerly examined the injury. My ankle was already swelling, and putting weight on it was out of the question. Panic threatened to set in, but I took deep breaths, forcing myself to remain calm. I reached into my backpack for the first aid kit and retrieved an elastic bandage. Carefully, I wrapped my ankle to provide some support, though I knew it was a temporary measure. I needed to find a way out of the gorge and back to safety, but with my injury, the prospect seemed daunting. I scanned my surroundings, noting that the opposite side of the gorge had a gentler slope with more vegetation, potential handholds that could aid in my ascent. However, crossing the stream posed another challenge. The water was shallow but swift, and the rocks were likely slippery. Using a sturdy branch I found nearby as a makeshift crutch, I hobbled to the water's edge. Testing each step, I slowly made my way across the stream, the cold water numbing my injured ankle slightly. Reaching the other side, I rested for a moment, gathering my strength for the climb ahead. I began the ascent, using the branch and nearby shrubs to pull myself upward. Every movement sent jolts of pain through my ankle, but I pressed on, driven by the imperative to reach higher ground. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the gorge, sweat streaming down my face and my breathing ragged. I knew that continuing the hike was no longer an option. I needed to find a safe spot to set up camp and rest my injury. I spotted a small clearing nearby, sheltered by a cluster of trees. With great effort, I limped to the spot and set down my pack. Setting up the tent was a slow process. I never used to hike alone. I'd always tell myself it was a safety thing, but truthfully, I didn't like the silence. When you're alone in the woods, the quiet presses down on you, and every snap of a twig sounds like something it shouldn't. But things changed that summer. I was dealing with a lot: breakup, work burnout, insomnia that came and went like tides. I started walking more, getting up early and wandering trails around my area before the sun had a chance to fully rise. Eventually, I wanted more than the local loop. I wanted space, real space. It was late July when I picked a long solo hike out near a place called Jarrow Creek. It wasn't a touristy area, and that was the draw. The path followed a ridge, dropped down into a gulch, then curved up into some old-growth forest. There was a half-collapsed fire tower at the farthest point, something the online forum called a reward for those who make it. About 17 miles round trip, and not exactly flat. The kind of trail that left you bone-tired and sunburned, but satisfied. I packed light but smart: water filter, rain cover, extra food, med kit. I left my route and plans with a friend and told her I'd check in that evening. I parked at a gravel pull-off just before 6 a.m. Nobody else around. That should have told me something. The trail started easy, almost too easy. Wide path, firm ground, shaded by pine. The sun came up fast, filtering down in gold shafts that gave everything a kind of artificial peace. But after a few miles, the incline picked up and the trees thinned out. I passed old trail markers nailed to trees, most of them half-rotted or faded white. Some were hanging sideways, like they'd given up trying to help anyone a long time ago. There was a point, maybe 5 miles in, where the air changed. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't colder and nothing smelled different, but it felt like I'd crossed into a part of the woods that didn't care if people came through or not. Like it wouldn't help you if something happened. The brush was denser, and the trail narrowed. Birds were still chirping, but there were long silences between their calls. I thought about turning around. It would have been easy. Just say screw it, go back to the car, grab a burger on the way home. But I'd come out here to be alone, and the kind of tired I had didn't go away with a cheeseburger. The descent into the gulch was steep, switchbacks carved into loose gravel that didn't hold well underfoot. I slipped more than once. By the time I reached the bottom, my thighs were burning and I was soaked with sweat. There was a stream there, mostly dry except for a shallow trickle. I filtered some water, had a granola bar, and sat down for 10 minutes. That's when I saw the boot print. It was fresh, deep enough to tell someone had walked through maybe an hour or two before me. I remember staring at it, wondering why that bothered me. It should have been a good sign, right? Someone else was out here, and they were ahead of me. But I didn't like that I hadn't heard or seen them, and the print was wrong. Not in the way it was shaped, normal hiking boot, but the way it pointed. It was angled sharply off the trail, toward the thickest part of the woods. No side trail, no markers, just brush and trees and slope. I tried not to dwell on it. People go off trail all the time. Maybe they were doing some dispersed camping or hunting. Maybe they were looking for a shortcut. But something about the way the boot print sat in the dirt half filled with a little stream water, gave me a cold feeling in my stomach. I moved on slowly. The incline was sharp again, and the trail was harder to follow. I had GPS on my watch, but the tree cover made it glitchy. Sometimes it told me I was floating 50 feet above sea level. Sometimes it spun the compass without reason. I started watching the ground more than the path, making sure I didn't miss any faded trailblazes. But it was all too easy to wander slightly left or right without noticing. It must have been around 11 when I stopped for lunch, maybe 2/3 of the way through. I was back in shade under tall firs. Everything smelled like warm sap and dry needles. I sat against a stump, stretching my calves and sipping slow from my bottle. That's when I heard it. A short, sharp whistle. It wasn't a bird. I grew up around woods, and I know what a bird sounds like. This was too short, too deliberate. Just two rising notes, then silence. I froze, listening. Then it happened again, slightly closer. Same notes. I don't know what it was about that whistle, but it didn't sit right. Maybe if I'd heard voices, laughter, or even footsteps, it would have felt better. But just that sound, out in the quiet, like someone wanted me to know they were there but didn't want to be seen, it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I packed up fast. Didn't even finish my food. I didn't want to turn around. Not yet, but I moved quicker. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, trying to hear anything behind me, but the forest just swallowed sound. You'd hear something, then it'd vanish completely, like it had never happened. The last stretch up to the fire tower was brutal. The trail was overgrown, and some parts were more animal path than hiking route. A couple times, I had to climb over down trees or slide through thick brush. I remember one spot where I couldn't find the next blaze for a full 5 minutes. I was about to head back when I finally spotted it. Faint red paint on a fallen log. When I broke through to the clearing at the top, I almost cried. The fire tower was there just like the forum said. 3 metal legs were rusted through and gone, and the 4th one leaned against the stone base like a snapped bone. But it was something solid, something man-made. I dropped my pack and sat on the stone steps, letting the sun hit my face. I stayed there maybe 30 minutes. No whistle, no footprints, no sound but the breeze and distant birds. I told myself I'd imagined it. Just nerves. I'd been pushing too hard lately, not sleeping well. I even laughed to myself, thinking about how I'd tell the story later, how I spooked myself on a perfectly normal hike. Then I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the other footprints. There were 2 sets now. One from earlier, the one I'd seen near the stream, and a second, smaller set. These ones were fresher. The dirt wasn't even dry yet. Both led up to the fire tower. Neither led back down. I stood there, completely still. My heart started pounding in my throat. I looked around the clearing, then back at the woods. I didn't see anyone. No tents, no gear. But someone had come up here, recently, and they hadn't come back down. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either. I moved fast, carefully, back the way I came. Every step felt like it echoed. Every snapping twig behind me made me whip my head around. I didn't stop to drink. I didn't stop to eat. I just wanted to get back below the ridge, out of the trees, into the open again. It was about halfway down the slope that I lost the trail. I'd been too focused on speed and not enough on navigation. The brush thickened, and the markers vanished. I circled back twice, trying to find the last blaze. My watch was useless again, pointing every direction at once. I felt that cold creep in again, the realization that I could be 5 feet from the trail and never know it. The trees all looked the same. The shadows changed minute by minute. I forced myself to sit, breathe, think. I checked my backup map and compass, took stock of my position. I knew roughly where the trail should be. I moved slowly now, deliberate. 10 minutes later, I found the path again, and I found something else. Tarp. Blue, standard camping tarp, tucked between 2 trees. I almost missed it. My stomach dropped. I crept closer, slowly. There was no tent, no gear, just the tarp laid out flat. A dark stain in the middle. Could have been dirt or old water damage. Could have been something else. I didn't look too long. I didn't want to know. I turned and kept walking, my pace faster now. The sun was dipping by the time I made it back to the stream in the gulch. The light was orange, casting long shadows that looked like figures. I started hearing things again. Short snaps, whistles, once what sounded like a cough. But I never saw anyone. The climb out of the gulch nearly broke me. My legs were jelly, and I had to stop every 50 feet just to breathe. But I pushed. I thought of my car, the smooth gravel road, my friend expecting my text. I didn't want to sleep in these woods. I didn't want to close my eyes here. When I finally saw the gravel through the trees, I nearly sobbed. My car was untouched, sitting there like nothing had happened. I threw my pack in the back seat and drove without even changing my shoes. I never went back. I tried to look up more about the trail afterward, but the forum post I'd read was gone. The site itself seemed half abandoned. I searched for reports, news, anything about disappearances near Jarrow Creek. Nothing. I told myself it was just a bad trip, bad timing. But sometimes, when I wake up sweating in the middle of the night, I see that second set of prints. The ones that didn't lead back. And I wonder if I was ever really alone out there. I've always liked hiking alone. It's not about being antisocial or trying to prove something. I just enjoy the quiet, the sound of my boots against the dirt, the creak of the trees when the wind moves through them, the way you start hearing your own breath louder than anything else after a few miles. No one asking you to slow down or speed up. No talking, just walking. The trail I picked wasn't anything special, just one I hadn't done yet. Tucked out near the Tennessee-Kentucky border, inside one of those less visited national forests. I had a long weekend off and needed a break from my apartment, from people, from everything. The trail was called Barren Ridge. Didn't sound inviting, but the reviews online said it had great views near the summit, lots of switchbacks, not too heavily trafficked. Perfect. I parked at the trailhead around 10 a.m. on a Friday. No other cars there. Weather was cool but sunny. A little breeze. Just enough to keep you from sweating too early. I had my pack, food, water, GPS watch, and a printed topographical map just in case. Phone was already out of service, which I expected. The trailhead sign looked weathered but still readable. A few bullet holes in the metal like someone had been target practicing. Classic rural trail vibes. First couple miles were smooth. Wide trail, mostly flat. Pine needles underfoot. I took my time, stopping every now and then to drink water or listen. Forests always make their own kind of noise. Not silence exactly, just layers of sound you don't notice until you're alone. Wind brushing through the trees. A squirrel hopping across dry leaves. Birds shifting around in the canopy. Every now and then I'd hear a branch crack behind me, and I'd turn, half expecting to see someone catching up. But there was never anyone there. Probably just animals. I passed a fork about 3 miles in. The sign had an arrow pointing left with the words, Barren Ridge Summit 4.8 miles. The other arrow was faded out. Couldn't even read it. Looked like someone had scratched the paint off with a knife. I stuck with the left path toward the summit as planned. Another hour passed, maybe more. The trail got narrower and more uneven. Rocks and roots forced me to watch my footing more closely. The tree cover thickened, which made it darker even though it was only mid-afternoon. No cell signal, no people, no animals I could see. Just me and the trail. Around 3 p.m., I stopped to eat a protein bar and check my GPS. I was still on the main trail, still making progress toward the summit. But I felt like something was off. Not like danger, just an itch, like I'd missed something. I looked at the map again, and sure enough, the trail was supposed to curve eastward soon, but the terrain around me didn't look right. There should have been a I never really liked hiking with other people. I liked being alone out there. No conversations, no pretending to be interested in someone's stories while trying to enjoy the quiet. Just me, the trees, the crunch of boots on dirt, and that wide, quiet feeling that only shows up when there's nothing man-made in sight. So when I had a 3-day weekend coming up last October, I picked a remote stretch of trail I'd been eyeing for a while. It wasn't on any national park brochure or Instagram page. No hashtags, no drone footage. It was just an old logging trail that had been shut down sometime in the 1980s, overgrown, unmaintained, and mostly forgotten. A narrow sliver of earth cutting through dense woodland, lined with downed trees and crumbling rock. Locals called it Deadfall Trail. I knew it by that name because a guy I met at a small gear shop a few months back had mentioned it in passing. Said something like, "You ever try Deadfall? It's not marked anymore, but if you find the old trailhead near Tanner's Ridge, it's still walkable. Just watch your footing. Lotta old debris." That was enough for me. I wrote down the name in my phone and made a note of the general area. When that long weekend came up, I pulled the trigger. I packed light but smart 3 days worth of food, a hydration bladder, a filter straw, first aid, a map, and a compass. I also brought a paper printout of the terrain from an old forestry website, which showed where the trail roughly should have been before the forest swallowed it up. No GPS. The point of hikes like these was to feel like I'd left the world behind. I didn't even bring earbuds, just silence and my boots. I parked my truck at the edge of a washed-out service road about an hour from the nearest town. The trees were already golden with fall, and dry leaves skittered across my windshield as I stepped out. Wind cut low through the trunks, cold but not biting. Perfect weather for hiking. I locked up the truck, hoisted my pack, and walked the last quarter mile up the service road until I saw the rusted sign. No maintenance beyond this point. There it was. The first few miles were straightforward enough. The trail, though overgrown, still followed a clear path between high ridges. Trees bent over the route like a tunnel, and the sunlight filtered through like it had passed through amber. Squirrels rustled in the brush, and birds cut across the sky. No signs of people, no trash, no beer cans, just the way I liked it. By the end of day one, I'd made it to a small stream that trickled down a sloped rock face. I pitched my tent on a soft patch of pine needles and boiled water for some freeze-dried pasta. My legs ached, but it was the good kind of pain, the kind that made the food taste better and the sleep deeper. I jotted a few notes into my journal, zipped up my bag, and passed out not long after the sun went down. I woke once, around 2 a.m., to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Could have been a raccoon or a deer. I didn't worry about it. I was too tired. Day 2 started with a steady incline. The trail here was much rougher. Logs fallen across the path, slick rock underfoot, and thorny brush clawing at my pants. I had to bushwhack more than I walked, ducking and pushing through branches that hadn't seen a person in years. But I stayed on course, checking the paper map and compass every hour or so. The terrain rose steeply to the west, so I knew I had to stay level or lean eastward if I wanted to stay on track. It wasn't until early afternoon that I noticed something that didn't feel right. There was a section of forest that just felt different. The air was still thicker somehow, not quiet but muffled, like the trees were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. I thought maybe it was just the pressure dropping, a sign of oncoming weather, but the sky above was clear. The trail here narrowed to a thread, weaving between boulders and massive root systems. I had to stop more often to reorient myself. Then, around 3 p.m., I found something strange, an old boot. It was lying on its side near the base of a tree, half covered in moss. The sole was cracked, and the laces were gone. It had been there a long time. I thought maybe it belonged to one of those old forestry workers. But when I picked it up, I saw it was a newer brand, something I'd seen in REI. The leather was too soft to be decades old. I set it back down and kept moving, but I started noticing other things after that. A torn strap from a backpack tangled in some branches. A shredded piece of nylon fabric snagged on a rock. It wasn't a lot, but enough to make me uneasy, like someone had come through here recently and didn't make it all the way out. Then, not long before dusk, I came across the campsite. It was just off the trail, hidden behind a screen of brush. I smelled it before I saw it. Something sour and earthy, like rotting wood and sweat. The tent was collapsed, sun-bleached and covered in dirt. There were empty food wrappers around, a crushed water bottle, and the burned-out remains of a fire ring. I stood there a long time, No animals had torn into it. No signs of a struggle. But something about it felt abandoned. Not packed up and left. Just left. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. Once, I thought I heard breathing just outside the tent, slow and heavy. But when I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was just wind or an animal, that it was my imagination turning shadows into shapes. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't close my eyes again until the sun came up. The third day was supposed to be a short hike back toward the lower ridges, then a slow loop that'd eventually bring me back to the service road from the opposite direction. I planned to finish by late afternoon, but I never found the loop. I followed where it should have been, checking my map again and again. The terrain looked right, same slope, same rock formations, but the trail markers were gone. Completely gone. No old blazes on the trees, no beaten path. I was walking blind. I circled back 3 times, trying to triangulate my location with the map and compass. Each time I thought I'd found my bearings, I'd stumble into unfamiliar ground again. More deadfall, thicker brush, ridges that weren't marked. By noon, I had to admit I was lost. It didn't make sense. I'd never been that far off trail before. I should have hit the loop by then, but the land didn't match the topography I had. Felt wrong, like the forest had changed since the map was drawn. I didn't panic. Not yet. I still had food and water. Still had daylight. I could backtrack, maybe find that collapsed tent again, use that as a landmark. But then I twisted my ankle. I was crossing a narrow gully when the rock beneath me gave out. My foot slipped between 2 roots and I heard a pop, like a knuckle cracking, but deeper. The pain hit a second later, sharp and hot, like someone driving a nail into the side of my leg. I fell, rolled halfway down the slope. When I stopped, I was covered in leaves and mud, and my ankle was already starting to swell. I tried to stand but couldn't put any weight on it. I bit down on the inside of my cheek to keep from yelling. That's when the fear really started to creep in. I was alone, off trail, injured, and losing daylight fast. There was no cell signal out here, and no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone about the Deadfall Trail. I just said I was going hiking for a few days. No one was coming. I crawled back up the slope, dragging my leg. It took almost an hour just to cover a few hundred feet. Every move sent jolts of pain through my ankle. I wrapped it with a spare shirt and duct tape, as tight as I could stand it, then cut a branch to use as a crutch. I couldn't hike out that day. No chance. I'd have to stay another night and try to move again tomorrow, slow and careful, in small sections. If I could at least get high enough to see a ridge or road, I might find my way out. I picked a flat spot between 2 trees and made camp again. I didn't eat much, just sipped water and kept listening. Every sound in the woods felt closer, like things were circling me, watching. Then, just before dark, I heard something that made my blood go cold. Voices, far off, maybe 100 yards away. I couldn't make out words, just the low hum of speech. But they were there, real. Not the wind, not an animal. People. I yelled, loud as I could. Hey, I'm over here. The voices stopped. I kept yelling. Nothing, just the wind again. I waited another hour before giving up. They never came closer, never called back. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I held my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, just staring into the dark. My body was frozen in place, listening for those voices to return. But they never did. The next day, I forced myself to move. Inch by inch, I limped through the woods, dragging my leg, stopping every few minutes to rest. My lips cracked. My hands were raw from gripping the branch. I followed the sun, heading east, praying I'd find the old service road or some sign of human life. Took me 9 hours to make it less than 2 miles. Then, I've been hiking alone for years. Not for the thrill, not because I'm trying to prove something to myself or anyone else. It's just quiet out there. My job in the city drains me. Screens all day, fake smiles, pointless meetings. But in the woods, it's just my boots on the ground. my breath in my chest, and the occasional squirrel darting across the path. That's it. That's all I need. It was mid-October when I took this trip. I remember because the leaves were all fire and gold, and the air had that dry, sharp bite that only comes around when summer's truly gone. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, somewhere up in the Allegheny Mountains, northwest Pennsylvania. A 6-day loop through some old-growth forest with just enough elevation change to get my heart going. Not many people take that loop. It's not advertised well, and it's considered intermediate to hard depending on the weather. I liked that. Fewer people, more quiet. I parked my truck at a ranger station, signed in, left a copy of my route plan, and got going early in the morning. The first day went smooth. The trail was clear, marked well, though the trees were so thick in some places you barely had sunlight. I made camp near a small creek, filtered water, boiled some rice, and read a paperback until I couldn't see the words anymore. I remember thinking, this is exactly what I needed. Second day was more uphill, rougher terrain. There was a stretch where I had to scramble over wet rocks, slick with moss. My right knee buckled a bit, but nothing major. I just took a break, tied the laces tighter, and moved slower. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that gave a view over miles of forest. No houses, no roads, just trees. I camped again near a natural rock overhang. It was colder that night. I wore my hat in the sleeping bag and kept my knife close by, not out of fear, just habit. You never know what kind of animal might come sniffing around. Third day changed things. I started early, hoping to make more miles before the rain that was forecasted. Clouds were already thick by morning. The trail took me downhill, winding tight through narrow gaps between boulders, and for the first time I felt a little off. Not afraid, just alert, like something had shifted. It was quiet, even for the woods. No birds, no wind, just me breathing, and the sound of my steps on dead leaves. I figured it was just the weather coming in. Maybe the animals had hunkered down. Around noon, I stopped to eat. Beef jerky, dried apples, some almonds. Sat on a stump with my back to a ridge. That's when I noticed footprints on the trail. Fresh ones. 2 sets, maybe 3, going in the same direction as me. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the station. No tents, no wrappers, no sign of life. Just these boot prints in the wet leaves and soft dirt. At first I was glad. Company meant safety, right? But the prints were odd. Wide stride, heavy heel pressure, like whoever it was had been moving fast. I couldn't tell how recent they were, but they couldn't be more than a few hours old. I looked ahead, but the trail curved out of sight. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. No reason really, just a gut feeling. I packed up and kept moving, slower now. I scanning everything. I didn't hear or see anyone for the rest of the day, but the unease stuck with me. That night, I camped beside a dead tree with a hollow trunk. No fire, just a cold meal and early sleep. I kept thinking about those prints. Fourth day. It rained most of the night. Everything was wet and heavy, even my boots. I wrapped my feet in extra socks, laced up tight, and pushed on. The trail narrowed into what was barely more than a deer path. Bushes grabbed at my pants. Spider webs across the face. No fun. Around mid-morning, I came to a clearing. A big one, maybe 50 yards across, ringed by spruce trees. And in the middle of the clearing was a torn-up tent. Not just collapsed, ripped. Poles snapped. Fabric shredded. Rain had soaked everything, but it was clear this wasn't weather damage. I walked up to it slow, scanning the tree line the whole time. No sound, just dripping leaves. I squatted and looked inside the tent. A sleeping bag, still zipped halfway. A backpack torn open. Food wrappers, some wet clothes, a water filter. No blood, no body, but it felt wrong. Too wrong. I stepped back, heart starting to race. What the hell happened here? A bear? Maybe. But the pack was torn from the top down, not clawed open like animals do. And the tent? No sign of a bite, just long, straight rips. I didn't linger. I got back on the trail fast, moving quick and quiet. No stopping. Every rustle in the brush made my pulse jump. Around 2 hours later, I noticed the same footprints again. Or maybe new ones. It was hard to tell in the mud, but they looked fresh. This time they were going toward me, like whoever made them had turned around. That made my stomach twist. I didn't stop that night, just kept walking with my headlamp on until the batteries got low. I found a rock shelf to crouch under, threw my sleeping bag down, and kept my back to the stone. I didn't sleep much. 5th day. I was done pretending I was out here for fun. My plan was to push through the last leg and get back to the truck by nightfall, even if it meant walking in the dark again. My food was low anyway, just a few protein bars and some trail mix. My hands were shaking when I packed up that morning, not from the cold. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. Midday, I found something else. A sock, just one, caught on a low branch. Gray, wet, but it hadn't been there long. Maybe blown by wind, but it was high shoulder level. That didn't sit right. I looked around. Trees, rocks, no other sign of anyone. I didn't touch it. I just walked on, faster now. That afternoon, the trail got worse. Erosion had taken big bites out of the path. I had to skirt around, grabbing roots and sliding down on my ass. I slipped once, landed hard on my hip, got up covered in mud. Every sound was a threat by now. Every snapping twig made me freeze. By dusk, I was maybe 5 miles from the truck. That's when I heard it. Actual noise. Not animals, asterisk people star. A voice, just one. Sharp. Male, I think, but far off. I couldn't make out words, just the tone. It didn't sound normal. It wasn't shouting for help or calling to someone. It was just yelling. Angry. Or scared. Or both. Came from behind me. I didn't stop to think. I ran. As fast as I could without breaking my ankle. My pack bounced against my back. My legs burned. But I didn't stop. The trail curved and dipped and rose again. But I didn't stop. Then I heard something else. Branches breaking. Fast footsteps. Not animal. Not one person either. More than one. Running. Chasing. I left the trail. I ducked into the trees, moving low, off path. Heart hammering. I pushed through thorns, scraped my face, almost lost my balance 3 times. But I kept going. I didn't stop until I found a ditch, deep and full of rotted leaves. I slid into it and stayed down, chest to the ground, barely breathing. They passed maybe 2 minutes later. I saw legs. 3 people, all men, dirty clothes. One of them had something in his hand, a long metal rod or maybe a crowbar. They weren't talking, just looking, heads turning left and right, scanning. One of them stopped right near the ditch. I could see the mud on his boots. He stood there for a while. My face was in the leaves. I didn't move. Eventually, they moved on. I stayed in that ditch until full dark. Cold, soaked, teeth chattering. Then I moved. Quiet, no light, just feeling my way. Took me over 2 hours to reach the road by the ranger station. My truck was still there. No one else's car. I unlocked it with shaking hands, climbed in, locked the doors, and didn't even start the engine for a minute. I just sat there, breathing hard. When I got back to town, I went straight to the ranger's office. Told them everything. Every damn thing. They took it seriously. Called the sheriff. Took my report. I showed them where I found the tent on the map, where I saw the prints, heard the voices. They sent a team out. 3 days later, they found that destroyed tent. And bones. Not many. Scattered. Animals had gotten to them, but they confirmed it was human. No ID. Nothing to match dental records to. I asked if they found anyone else. Any men on the trail. They didn't say. They just told me to be careful if I ever came back. I haven't.